Does thinking develop individually, or does it emerge in social interactions? Few debates in developmental psychology have been as influential as the one between Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. For decades, their ideas have shaped learning and educational designs as well as research all over the world. Yet, despite sharing an interest in development, they proposed very different explanations of how children develop cognitively. In this video, we'll break down 5 key differences between their theories, and by the end of it, you will have a clear and structured understanding of where their developmental models diverge and why this debate still matters today for psychology, education, and even artificial intelligence. Number 1. Object and method of study. So let's begin with a similarity. Both Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky were interested in the genesis of psychological phenomena, that is, in how they emerge and develop over time. However, they focused on different psychological phenomena and therefore developed different methods of studying them. Jean Piaget focused on the development of structures of intelligence and knowledge. He wanted to understand how children reason, how they solve problems, and how they construct knowledge through interactions with the world. For doing that, he developed his famous clinical method. He interviewed children, presented them with problems, and carefully analyzed their answers and particularly their mistakes. He also conducted longitudinal observations and compared children of different ages. Vygotsky, in contrast, studied the development of higher psychological functions, including thinking, speech, memory, attention, and will. He wasn't just interested in answering the question what higher psychological functions are, but how higher psychological functions emerge and develop. For doing that, he developed the experimental genetic method, which allowed him to trace how higher psychological functions emerge. So he created conditions for their development and wanted to observe their development in the making. A useful metaphor to illustrate these two different approaches to research might be a series of snapshots and a film. Piaget's approach resembles a series of snapshots, with each photograph capturing a particular moment of development. And by comparing the snapshots, Piaget reconstructs the developmental process. Vygotsky's approach resembles a kind of a film. Rather than reconstructing development from successive snapshots, he attempts to observe development as it unfolds and to reveal the process through which a new psychological function emerges and changes over time. In this sense, we might say that Piaget was interested in the architecture of cognitive development, whereas Vygotsky focused on its dynamics. Number 2, mechanisms of development. For Piaget, cognitive development is driven by the child's active construction of knowledge through interactions with the physical world. Importantly, this interaction is not one-sided. The child acts upon the objects, but the objects also influence and constrain the child's actions. Development emerges through this continuous interaction between subject and object. Piaget described 3 key mechanisms of development: assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. Assimilation means fitting new experiences into existing cognitive structures. The child interprets the world using what they already know. Accommodation occurs when existing structures are no longer sufficient and must be modified or reorganized. Equilibration is the process that balances assimilation and accommodation. When expectations no longer match reality, a state of cognitive imbalance emerges. And to restore balance, the child reorganizes their structures of intelligence, gradually developing more complex forms of reasoning. For example, imagine a child who knows that dogs are furry animals with 4 legs. When a child first meets a sheep, they might call it a dog. Piaget would describe this as assimilation. The new experience is interpreted through an existing cognitive structure. Eventually, however, the child realizes that dogs and sheep are different animals. The original concept is no longer sufficient and must be reorganized. This is accommodation. Through countless adjustments like this, children's structures of intelligence become more differentiated and complex. And the key outcome of this is disintegration, the child's growing ability to consider multiple perspectives at once, simultaneously, as well as to coordinate perspectives and to mentally reverse transformations. Vygotsky, in contrast, proposed a fundamentally different mechanism of development. For him, development of higher psychological functions occurs not in the process of interaction with objects, but rather in the process of interaction with other people, that is, in social interactions. He formulated his idea in the general genetic law of cultural development, according to which every higher psychological function first emerges between people in social interactions as an intrapsychological process and is later internalized by the individual, becoming an intrapsychological process. A classic example is the pointing gesture. An infant reaches toward an object that is out of reach. Initially, this is simply an unsuccessful grasping movement. However, when an adult interprets this movement as a request and responds by handing over the object, the action acquires a social meaning. Over time, the child learns to use pointing as a communicative gesture. So what began as an unsuccessful physical movement turns into a psychological tool, that is, a sign. Thus, for Piaget, development is driven by the child's interaction with the objects and by individual construction of knowledge. For Vygotsky, development is driven by social interactions mediated by cultural tools. Difference number 3, stages of development. Another important difference concerns how Piaget and Vygotsky understood the overall course of development. Piaget proposed 4 universal stages of cognitive development: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational. According to Piaget, these stages emerge in a fixed sequence. Each stage builds upon the previous one, and no stage can be skipped. A useful metaphor is a ladder. Though Piaget didn't use this metaphor himself, it is often used to illustrate his developmental theory. Cognitive growth involves moving from one level of development to the next. Children may climb at different rates, but the sequence of stages is universal. Vygotsky questioned the idea that development follows a universal sequence of stages independent of culture and history. If Piaget's theory might be illustrated as a ladder, Vygotsky's theory could be visualized as a stage. For Vygotsky, development unfolds as a social drama. Higher psychological functions first appear on the front stage in interactions between people, and then they move backstage, becoming part of the individual psychological life through the process of internalization. But the stage itself is not universal. The scripts, the tools, the symbols are provided by the surrounding culture. And since different cultures provide different forms of participation, they also create different developmental paths. So the two metaphors capture a fundamental difference between the two theories. For Piaget, development is primarily a journey upward through a given sequence of stages. For Vygotsky, development is primarily a social drama, which is always culturally specific. So Piaget was looking for what is universal in human development, while Vygotsky focused on what is culturally and historically specific in human development. Difference 4: speech and thinking. One of the most famous disagreements between Piaget and Vygotsky concerns the relationship between speech and thinking. For Piaget, cognitive development comes first. Speech reflects the child's current level of thinking. As children's structures of intelligence become more sophisticated, so does their language. In other words, for Piaget, thinking drives language development. Vygotsky strongly disagreed. For him, speech is not just simply a reflection of thought, but this is something what makes higher forms of thinking possible. Children do not just express their thoughts through language, they learn to think through language. Now imagine a child trying to solve a puzzle. The child says, not this piece, maybe this one, okay, turn it around. Piaget believed that this kind of self-directed speech reflects the child's egocentrism. That means that the child isn't yet fully capable of taking into account different perspectives. And so, as thinking develops, this form of self-directed speech gradually declines. Vygotsky would interpret it very differently. The child is using language as a cognitive tool to guide attention, plan actions, and solve the problem. In other words, the child is thinking out loud. So for Vygotsky, the self-directed speech does not disappear with development. It becomes inner speech, that silent dialogue we carry on with ourselves as adults. So while Piaget saw speech primarily as a reflection of cognitive development, Vygotsky saw it as one of the main engines of thinking itself. Their disagreement also extended to the formation of concepts. For Vygotsky, the formation of concepts is closely linked with the acquisition of meaning. A child learns to use words and other signs as psychological tools, gradually mastering the meanings shared by a culture. In this sense, development involves transforming meaningless signs into meaningful concepts. Piaget approached the problem very differently. For him, what matters is not the word itself, but the cognitive structure that supports it. The child may know the word long before they fully understand the concept behind it. A child may correctly use words such as more, less, or same, and yet still fail conservation tasks, such as recognizing that the quantity of water remains the same after it is poured into a taller and narrower glass. And this happens because the necessary logical operations have not yet developed. Thus, for Piaget, concept formation is primarily the process of constructing cognitive structures that make conceptual understanding possible. And for Vygotsky, concept formation is primarily the process of acquiring and internalizing meaning. One of the most fundamental disagreements between Piaget and Vygotsky concerns the relationship between learning and development. For Piaget, learning must correspond to the child's current level of cognitive development. Children can fully understand new ideas only when they have developed the structures of intelligence necessary to support them. This means that teaching cannot simply bypass developmental stages. So, for example, a teacher might explain a concept perfectly, but if a child hasn't yet developed the necessary structures of intelligence, genuine understanding will not occur. In this sense, in Piaget's view, development sets the conditions for learning. Vygotsky took a very different position. He argued that learning is one of the main engines of development. His most famous concept is the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. The ZPD is the gap between what a child can do independently and what a child can do with assistance from a more knowledgeable other. So for Vygotsky, the most effective teaching occurs within this zone. A good teacher does not simply adapt to the child's current level of development. Instead, learning creates the conditions for development. Now imagine a child who cannot solve a problem but succeeds with the help of a more knowledgeable peer. For Piaget, this might mean that the necessary cognitive structures are beginning to emerge. For Vygotsky, this collaborative activity is precisely the process through which new psychological functions develop. This difference reflects a broader contrast between the two developmental theories. For Piaget, learning follows development. For Vygotsky, learning leads development. Now, some final thoughts. It is common to contrast Piaget and Vygotsky as from individual to social versus from social to individual. Though this idea captures an important difference, it is definitely an oversimplification. Piaget did not ignore social interactions, and Vygotsky did not deny the importance of individual developmental specifics. However, their disagreement was deeper. Piaget explained development primarily through the individual's active construction and reorganization of knowledge through interaction with the world. Vygotsky explained development primarily through social interactions and the internalization of culturally mediated higher psychological functions. In many ways, this contrast runs through all the differences that we've discussed today. Piaget emphasized interactions with objects. Vygotsky emphasized interactions with people. Piaget saw speech as reflecting thinking. Vygotsky saw speech as shaping thinking. Piaget was looking for what is universal in human development. Vygotsky was looking for what is culturally and historically specific in it. Neither perspective is sufficient on its own, and modern developmental psychology has inherited insights from both traditions. Children actively construct knowledge, as Piaget argued, but they do so in a given sociocultural context, as Vygotsky emphasized. So today we know that development is both individual and social. We construct knowledge ourselves, but we never do it alone. If this video was helpful, like it and follow for more. Also, please do let me know in the comments if you're interested in a follow-up video about the way how the debate between Vygotsky and Piaget was continued in the Russian scientific tradition.